January 17, 1944. The rugged terrain of Italy's northern front, gripped by the icy breath of winter. Through the haze of smoke and the distant rumble of artillery, a unit of black soldiers, part of the famed 92nd Infantry Division, moved cautiously across the battlefield. Their mission was clear, but their presence was an anomaly to both allies and enemies alike. These soldiers, often relegated to menial tasks or support roles back home, had fought tooth and nail to prove their worth. As the sounds of combat softened into eerie quiet, a strange encounter unfolded. German POWs, with their hands raised in surrender, met these soldiers not with the usual contempt or harsh treatment expected in war, but with an unexpected display of kindness. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as men from two opposing forces, defined by race, nationality, and ideology, exchanged glances. What followed would defy all expectations of war's brutal logic. By 1944, the tide of World War II had shifted dramatically. On the European front, the Allies, now well established in Italy after the successful invasions of Sicily and mainland Italy, were preparing for a final push to rid Europe of Nazi control. The brutality of war was evident in every trench and battlefield, but there was also a sense of inevitable victory as the Allies closed in on Germany from both the east and the west. Yet even as the war raged on, certain battles were not just fought with weapons but with ideals. Ideals of race, courage, and the dignity of the individual. In the United States, the military was still segregated, and black soldiers were relegated to specific, often underappreciated roles. Despite their willingness to serve, they were seen by many as less capable than their white counterparts. African American troops were frequently assigned to labor and service units, often tasked with construction, supply, and support duties, jobs that were crucial but rarely celebrated. Some, however, were determined to prove themselves in battle. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, had been among the first black units to receive combat assignments. Despite facing discrimination and prejudice from within their own ranks, they fought fiercely in campaigns across Italy. Their journey was far from easy, as their commitment to proving themselves on the front lines was met with both suspicion and disdain by fellow soldiers, commanders, and sometimes even the public back home. Yet as they advanced through the Italian countryside, they were about to make a significant mark on history, not through the violence of war, but through an act of humanity that would leave both their comrades and their enemies stunned. The 92nd Infantry Division was a symbol of determination and resilience, an elite group of African American soldiers who had fought to be in combat, despite the pervasive racial barriers of the time. By January 1944, they were in the thick of the Italian campaign, pushing northward toward the heavily fortified German positions. The division was engaged in some of the most brutal and grueling fighting, particularly in the rugged mountains of central Italy, where terrain and weather made every step a challenge. The Buffalo Soldiers had faced harsh criticism and skepticism regarding their combat abilities, with many of their white counterparts doubting their capability to perform under fire. The unit's leadership, both black and white, fought to overcome these prejudices, but the tension between the soldiers and the military's racial views was ever present. It was a deeply divided atmosphere, one that left little room for camaraderie between the different racial groups within the U.S. military. But in the midst of the chaos of war, during an assault on a German-held position near the town of Scapoli in the winter of 1944, an unexpected and powerful event occurred. A group of German soldiers, caught in the crossfire as the Allies advanced, were captured by the 92nd Infantry Division. They were brought into custody under the watchful eyes of the Buffalo Soldiers, who, like their fellow soldiers, had expected to treat their prisoners as enemies, treat them with the stern detachment that was customary in wartime. Yet what unfolded next was something far different, and something that would forever change how both the Germans and the black soldiers viewed each other. The German prisoners, weary and beaten by the horrors of war, were shocked when the black soldiers did not treat them with the same disdain that they had come to expect from their captors. In an act that was practically unheard of in the brutal, dehumanizing environment of wartime captivity, the Buffalo Soldiers treated the German POWs with unexpected respect. They offered them food and water, helped them to their feet, and ensured their safety. acts of compassion that not only confused the prisoners but also stunned the soldiers' commanders. It was an act of decency that defied the standard expectations of a battlefield, one rooted not in racial hatred but in the values of humanity and respect. This act, small in its immediate scale but monumental in its symbolic power, would leave an indelible mark on both the German POWs and the black soldiers themselves. For the German POWs, the sight of black soldiers offering them food, water, and even words of encouragement was a deeply disorienting experience. They had expected to be treated with disdain, perhaps even violence, as the Allies had grown more relentless in their push toward Germany. But the Buffalo Soldiers' actions defied everything they had been led to believe about their enemies, particularly black soldiers. Many of the German POWs were confused, even stunned by the kindness they were shown. They had come to see their captors as racially inferior, and expected them to follow the same brutal practices that the Germans had used in occupied territories. What they encountered was a stark contrast, a humanity that transcended the racial boundaries that had been so deeply ingrained in both sides. For the black soldiers, this moment was equally profound. In a military where their courage and abilities were often questioned, this unexpected act of kindness was a chance to prove their strength in a way that went beyond mere physical endurance. It was a testament to their moral fortitude, showing that true strength lay not in inflicting suffering but in offering mercy. It was a quiet but powerful repudiation of the racial prejudice that had sought to define them, a moment where their actions spoke louder than words. From a tactical standpoint, the 92nd Infantry Division's mission in Italy was one of extreme difficulty. The Germans had entrenched themselves deeply in the mountainous regions, and the Allies' advance was slow and costly. The terrain was unforgiving, with steep slopes and narrow passes, and the harsh winter weather made movement even more treacherous. The Buffalo Soldiers had been tasked with holding strategic positions, often under heavy fire, while the broader Allied offensive continued to push toward the German heartland. When the German POWs were captured, the situation was still tense. With combat still raging nearby and the potential for further clashes always looming, the Buffalo Soldiers had to make quick decisions on how to handle their prisoners. Standard military doctrine would have called for immediate interrogation and harsh treatment, especially given the brutal nature of war on both sides. But in that moment, the soldiers of the 92nd Division chose not to adhere to the cold, mechanical logic of battlefield tactics. Instead, they took the moral high ground, showing mercy to men who had been their enemies just hours before. The tactical outcome of this encounter was not in the physical or strategic positioning of forces, but in the psychological impact it had on both sides. The Germans, confused by the unexpected kindness, found themselves questioning the stereotypes they had long held about black Americans. For the black soldiers, their humanity had been their greatest weapon, not their rifles or grenades. This act of compassion was a quiet but profound disruption to the usual dynamics of war, one that spoke to the soldiers' inner strength and resolve, far beyond any traditional military objective. From the perspective of the German POWs, the encounter with the Buffalo Soldiers was a bewildering experience, one that would stay with them long after the war. The expectation of brutality and harsh treatment was ingrained in them, as they had witnessed countless atrocities carried out by both sides during the course of the war. German soldiers had often been subjected to inhumane conditions, whether by Soviet forces on the Eastern Front or by the Allies in the West. The sight of black soldiers, often thought of as subservient or inferior, offering them kindness was not only unexpected but deeply jarring. The Germans had been trained to believe in the racial hierarchy that was fundamental to Nazi ideology, where the so-called Aryan race was considered superior, and people of African descent were often marginalized or dehumanized. To find themselves in the hands of black soldiers who treated them with dignity challenged every assumption they had held about their enemies. In some cases, the POWs were so astonished that they struggled to comprehend the actions unfolding before them. This unexpected treatment had a profound effect on the German prisoners' psychology. In the brutal world of war, where hatred and dehumanization often dictated interactions, the Buffalo Soldiers' display of empathy left many of the POWs in a state of disbelief. It was an act that transcended the usual logic of combat, forcing them to confront their own biases and perhaps even reconsider their views on race. Some German prisoners, when interviewed after the war, admitted that the kindness they received from the black soldiers had left them emotionally shaken, an experience they would struggle to reconcile with the violence and destruction they had been a part of. For many of these POWs, the humanity shown by the Buffalo Soldiers was a brief but powerful reminder of the shared bonds between people, even amidst the chaos of war. The act of kindness shown to the German POWs by the Buffalo Soldiers was not just a moment of individual compassion, but a reflection of leadership within the 92nd Infantry Division. Commanders, both black and white, had been keenly aware of the need to boost the morale of their troops, who faced not only the grueling demands of combat, but also the racial prejudices that lingered within their own ranks. The men of the 92nd had proven themselves time and again on the battlefield, but this moment was one where their leadership was tested in an entirely different way. For the officers within the division, allowing their men to treat prisoners with dignity, rather than strict hostility, was a decision that could have had significant consequences. There were risks involved, risks that the unit could be seen as soft or lacking the necessary resolve to follow orders. But in this instance, the leaders understood that true leadership was about more than just tactical superiority. It was about demonstrating values that transcended the battlefield, creating an example for the troops to follow. The effect on morale was immediate and powerful. The soldiers who witnessed the encounter with the POWs felt a deep sense of pride, not just in their military prowess, but in their humanity. Many had been raised in a segregated America, where they were constantly reminded of their supposed inferiority. This act of compassion showed them that their worth wasn't determined by the color of their skin or the limitations others tried to impose on them, but by their actions and the values they chose to uphold. The leadership within the 92nd Division had created an atmosphere where soldiers were encouraged to rise above the hatred and divisiveness of the war. Their unity was built on respect, not just for their comrades, but for humanity itself. In turn, the incident strengthened the division's cohesion and resolve. As word of the encounter spread among the troops, both black and white soldiers alike were forced to confront their own biases. The unexpected act of kindness from the black soldiers became a symbol of moral strength, one that reverberated through the ranks of the 92nd and beyond. It was a leadership decision that had far-reaching implications, not just for the Buffalo Soldiers themselves, but for the broader narrative of race and honor in the U.S. military. The treatment of German POWs by the Buffalo Soldiers resonated far beyond the battlefield, carrying significant racial and symbolic weight. In a military deeply entrenched in segregation, where African American soldiers were often seen as less capable than their white counterparts, this moment was a powerful challenge to the racial assumptions of the time. It wasn't just about mercy on the battlefield. It was about rejecting the narrative that black soldiers were inherently inferior or unworthy of respect. In the context of the 1940s, when racial prejudice was endemic in both military and civilian life, the symbolism of black soldiers treating German prisoners with respect was revolutionary. The American military, though integrated in certain ways, was still largely segregated in practice. Black soldiers were frequently excluded from leadership roles, confined to certain divisions, or given the most dangerous and undesirable tasks. Yet here, on the front lines of war, these men, often relegated to second-class status by their own nation, were demonstrating a level of humanity that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the war they were part of. For the Buffalo Soldiers, this act was not merely an expression of personal integrity, it was a statement. It symbolized their capacity for honor, even in the face of the racial discrimination they endured. Their decision to treat the POWs with dignity undermined the very logic of the racial hierarchy that had long been used to justify the segregation of black soldiers. In this moment, the black soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division proved that their worth could not be measured by their skin color or the prejudices of others, but by their actions. On a broader scale, the event spoke to the potential for humanity even in the darkest hours of war. At a time when racial tensions in the United States were at an all-time high, the treatment of German POWs by black soldiers was an act that suggested a new possibility for unity, not just among soldiers of different races but among all people. It offered a glimpse of a future where respect and human dignity could transcend race. Even in the most unlikely of circumstances. The decisive moment came during the winter of 1944, when the 92nd Infantry Division advanced toward the small Italian village of Scapoli, caught between the sweeping Allied push from the south and the entrenched German forces resisting in the north. The battle for this stretch of land had been intense and relentless, marked by a series of hard-won victories and staggering losses. As the 92nd pushed forward, they encountered a group of German soldiers who had been left behind by their retreating comrades, desperate and fatigued from the relentless fighting. When the Germans surrendered, the typical expectations of military conduct were set. The captives would be searched, interrogated, and treated as enemy combatants in accordance with the rules of war. But what followed that day would set the 92nd Infantry Division apart. As the soldiers of the 92nd took charge of the prisoners, an unspoken decision passed through the ranks. They would not follow the brutal path often laid out in wartime. Instead, they treated the Germans with unexpected kindness, offering them food, water, and medical assistance where necessary. To the German soldiers, who had seen little but cruelty from their captors, this display was shocking. In the chaos of war, they had become accustomed to harsh treatment, at best indifference, at worst outright abuse. But here, under the watch of black soldiers, their perception of who was worthy of mercy was upended. These were men they had been taught to view as inferior, yet it was they who now showed compassion. Not their enemies, the Buffalo Soldiers, who had been subjected to their own racial discrimination in the military, understood the power of human dignity in a way that transcended their uniforms and the chains of prejudice that held many in their own nation. In this moment of intense conflict, they chose to rise above the cruelty of war and offer what they themselves had long been denied: respect. For the POWs, this encounter would become one of the most memorable of their lives. They had expected to be beaten, humiliated, or treated with disdain. What they received instead was a kindness that left them disoriented, questioning the fundamental beliefs about race and the enemy they had been taught to hate. The immediate aftermath of the encounter was one of stunned silence, both among the German POWs and the soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division. For the Buffalo Soldiers, the decision to treat their prisoners with compassion was not an easy one, but it was grounded in the shared understanding that the humanity of a soldier should not be defined by race. It was a powerful repudiation of the dehumanizing rhetoric that had been used to justify their own marginalization within the U.S. military. But this moment of mercy was not without its consequences. The reactions within the unit were mixed. Some soldiers felt a quiet pride in their actions, viewing it as a display of moral strength and integrity. Others, however, were unsure how to process what had just occurred. The military, particularly at the command level, was not accustomed to black soldiers defying expectations in such a manner. Mercy in the brutal context of war was not something easily understood or accepted, especially when the enemy was expected to be treated with contempt. The reactions among the German prisoners were equally complex. Many of the POWs, who had expected no more than the cold indifference of typical wartime captors, were left confused and humbled by the treatment they received. Some struggled to comprehend the kindness, unsure if it was a trick or a gesture born out of fear. Others, however, could not deny the humanity of the moment. They realized that their captors, whom they had likely dismissed as inferior, were capable of acts of decency, an idea that clashed violently with the racial hierarchy they had been taught to believe in. In the days that followed, whispers of the incident began to spread beyond the 92nd Infantry Division. The unusual act of compassion, while not widely publicized, caught the attention of higher military authorities. The command structure, while initially hesitant to embrace this act of mercy as a model for future behavior, was forced to reckon with the symbolism of what had transpired. The story of black soldiers treating German prisoners with unexpected kindness, despite the intense racial divisions within the military, began to subtly shift perceptions of African American soldiers. It wasn't just the success of the 92nd in battle that made an impression. It was their moral fortitude, a demonstration that the soldiers' strength wasn't only measured in firepower, but in their ability to uphold values of humanity, even in the most hostile of environments. In the broader context of the war, this encounter had far-reaching implications. It demonstrated that acts of mercy and respect could not only disrupt the expectations of war, but also challenge long-standing racial prejudices that had permeated the American military. The Buffalo Soldiers had shown the world that true courage didn't only lie in the battles fought on the front lines. It also existed in the quiet moments when humanity triumphed over hatred. The immediate aftermath of the encounter between the Buffalo Soldiers and the German POWs was felt most keenly within the 92nd Infantry Division. For many of the soldiers, this moment of mercy was a reaffirmation of their sense of pride and dignity. They had long been fighting not only against the Axis forces, but against the pervasive racial prejudice that had followed them throughout their lives and military careers. Treating the German prisoners with humanity was, in a way, a direct challenge to the racial stereotypes and discriminatory practices that they themselves had faced. While many soldiers within the division felt a deep sense of satisfaction, there were some who struggled with the decision. Some soldiers had been raised in a world where harshness toward the enemy was expected, where the principles of compassion were secondary to the brutal realities of war. For these men, the act of kindness was hard to reconcile with the overall purpose of the war. But as word spread, the moral clarity of the act began to resonate. It was no longer just about winning the war. It was about proving that African American soldiers were capable of exhibiting the same honor, integrity, and humanity as any other unit. For their commanders, the situation was equally complex. The 92nd had long been viewed with skepticism by other divisions, often unjustly so. In the wake of the POW encounter, the leadership of the division found themselves in a difficult position. On one hand, they had witnessed their soldiers act in a way that defied expectations, reinforcing the strength of their character. On the other hand, military leadership was still rooted in traditional wartime conduct, where mercy was often seen as a weakness rather than a strength. The act was a quiet rebellion against the conventional attitudes of the military, and it forced higher-ups to reconsider their assumptions about black soldiers. Despite the complexities, the 92nd Infantry Division's actions began to shift the broader narrative. The incident didn't immediately change the racial dynamics of the U.S. military, but it was a step toward undermining the idea that African American soldiers were less capable or deserving of respect than their white counterparts. It was an example of moral courage that extended far beyond the battlefield, challenging the deeply ingrained prejudices of the time. While the incident between the Buffalo Soldiers and the German POWs was not widely publicized at the time, its implications were far-reaching, especially when viewed through the lens of military and social history. The act of compassion, though small in the grand scope of World War II, was a significant moment in the larger struggle for racial equality within the U.S. military. It spoke to a shift in how African American soldiers were perceived, not as subordinate, not as inferior, but as fully capable individuals who could perform with honor, courage, and humanity. In the years that followed, the 92nd Infantry Division's actions during the Italian campaign would slowly gain recognition as an important chapter in the history of African American military service. Though the road to full integration of the U.S. Armed Forces was long and fraught with resistance, the Buffalo Soldiers' experience helped pave the way for the eventual desegregation of the military in 1948, under President Harry S. Truman's executive order. The symbolic power of their actions, however, was not just confined to their time in service. It was a catalyst for broader societal changes regarding race relations in the United States. Moreover, the respect shown to the German prisoners underscored a larger theme of humanity that transcended the divisions of the time. The racial prejudice that had permeated American society, and especially the military, was confronted by an act that proved mercy and moral fortitude were not qualities exclusive to one race. The Buffalo Soldiers demonstrated that true courage was not just about facing the enemy on the battlefield. It was about standing firm in one's values, even when the world around them was steeped in violence and hatred. In the decades following the war, as the U.S. military began to integrate more fully, the legacy of units like the 92nd Infantry Division helped shape a more inclusive and equitable military structure. Their actions in Italy, though not widely remembered in mainstream narratives, stand as a testament to the strength of character and humanity that African American soldiers brought to the fight. This episode, small yet significant, was a turning point not only in the history of the Buffalo Soldiers, but in the broader fight for racial equality in America. It proved that heroism could be defined by more than just the battles fought with weapons. It could also be defined by the humanity shown on the hardest of days. The incident where the Buffalo Soldiers treated German POWs with unexpected kindness stands as one of the quiet yet powerful moments of World War II. A moment not defined by gunfire or strategy, but by a fundamental assertion of human dignity amidst the brutalities of war. In an era when racial prejudices were entrenched both at home and on the battlefield, the actions of these black soldiers defied the expectations placed upon them. They chose compassion over cruelty, honor over hatred, and respect over the dehumanizing forces of war. This act of mercy was a small, fleeting moment, yet it resonates far beyond the Italian campaign of 1944. It speaks to the potential for humanity to flourish, even in the most harrowing circumstances, and to the power of individuals to rise above the systems that seek to define them. For the black soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, it was a demonstration that their worth could not be measured by the color of their skin or the limitations others sought to impose upon them, but by the strength of their character. It was a declaration that in war, as in life, the courage to do what is right is the truest form of heroism. For the German POWs, the unexpected kindness they received became a moment that shattered their preconceived notions of their captors. It forced them to question their own beliefs about race and humanity, leaving a lasting impression of the strength that can be found in mercy. In the end, the legacy of this encounter is not just in the military victories won or the battles fought, but in the quiet defiance against a world that sought to define soldiers by their skin color. It reminds us that even in war, the power of humanity is one of the most profound weapons we have.